The saxophone was invented in the late 1830s by Belgian instrument maker Adolphe Sax, who introduced it to the world in 1841. Sax wanted to design a musical instrument that combined the power and projection of the brass with the agility of the woodwinds. He received a patent for the saxophone in 1846, which by then had already won praise from the famous composer Hector Berlioz.
Dreamy, melancholic, sometimes with the hush of an echo. I do not know of any instrument having this specific tone quality.
While never completely adopted as an orchestral instrument, the saxophone did find an immediate and permanent home in military bands as well as within the walls of academia. Sax himself was hired to start the first saxophone class at the famed Paris Conservatory, beginning a long and proud tradition of the saxophone as a classical instrument. In the early 1900s, the saxophone began to gain a foothold across the Atlantic in more popular musical styles. Ensembles and players like the Brown Brothers Sextet and Rudy Wiedoeft introduced the instrument to a wider audience through approachable and fun music, and also began to expand the instrument's technical and sonic potential. The saxophone soon became an important voice in blues and jazz. The sax sections of the groups led by Count Basie, Duke Ellington, the Dorsey Brothers, and Glenn Miller defined new sounds, while players like Charlie Parker and later John Coltrane revolutionized the instrument's solo potential. While solidifying its place as a jazz instrument, the saxophone was becoming more accepted in the classical music tradition as well. Though Sax's original class at the Paris Conservatory ended in 1870, its re-establishment in 1944 with the appointment of Marcel Muehl was a defining moment for the instrument. Widely regarded as one of the greatest classical saxophonists of all time, Muehl was a pivotal figure in defining the instrument's classical technique, developing its repertoire and pedagogy, and establishing the Saxophone Quartet as a legitimate chamber ensemble. With Muehl paving the way, the classical saxophone began to see a renaissance in the United States and elsewhere. A new generation of performers and educators emerged with Sigurd Rascher, Larry Teal, Donald Sinta, Frederick Hemke, and Eugene Rousseau, doing much to further develop its repertoire and firmly establish the saxophone as a serious classical instrument. Today, the saxophone is heard in a wide variety of settings and musical styles, including military bands, jazz ensembles, pop and rock groups, and symphony orchestras. Now let's meet the members of the saxophone family. The modern saxophone family consists of 9 instruments: the soprillo, the sopranino, soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, bass, contrabass, and the subcontrabass. Other rarely used versions of the saxophone include the C soprano, mezzo-soprano, C melody, the slide sax, saxello, and the tubax. Here, we'll introduce the 4 most common saxophones.
The soprano saxophone is pitched in B-flat and is the highest of the most commonly used saxophones today. It's been included in the standard saxophone quartet configuration since the early 20th century and has been called for by such orchestral and band composers as Maurice Ravel, Richard Strauss, and Percy Grainger. The soprano has been increasingly used as a solo instrument, and its solo repertoire has steadily grown over the past several decades.
The alto saxophone is pitched in E-flat and sounds a perfect fifth below the soprano. It's the most used saxophone in classical music, as demonstrated by its extremely large body of repertoire. Many well-known composers have written solo works for the alto, including Alexander Glasnov and Jacques Ibert, while in the orchestra, its beautiful, dark, and malleable tone has been embraced by Georges Bizet, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Leonard Bernstein, and many others.
The tenor saxophone is pitched in B-flat and sounds an octave below the soprano. While an important voice in the saxophone quartet and concert band, its solo repertoire is still relatively limited. Composers such as Sergei Prokofiev and Paul Hindemith have used it in large ensemble works for its powerful sound and lyrical qualities.
The baritone saxophone is pitched in E-flat and sounds an octave below the alto. Often compared to the cello, the bari sax is the lowest voice in the saxophone quartet, providing the foundation for many of the quartet's harmonies. The bari sax is also the only commonly used saxophone to feature a low A key, which allows a player to perform string transcriptions at pitch. Solo repertoire for the baritone is also rather limited, but many orchestral composers, including George Gershwin, Bela Bartok, and Charles Ives, have incorporated it into their works.
A few of the less common saxophones that you might see from time to time include the sopranino, the C melody sax, and the bass saxophone. Of the three, the bass is the most used, appearing in large saxophone ensembles, a few works for wind ensemble, and even as a solo instrument.
Though the saxophone quartet in the soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone configuration has been around since the mid-1850s, it rose to prominence as an ensemble during the late 1920s with the formation of the Quatuor de la Garde Républicaine, which later became the Marcel Mule Saxophone Quartet. Voiced much like a string quartet, the saxophone quartet remains a distinct and viable ensemble to this day.